very much. It's always a pleasure to be with you on a panel. With Nico, we would like to concentrate on something maybe which we didn't touch upon yet, which could be interesting in terms of thinking about the living archives. Nico speaks since 1998 always about activating an archive. And one way of activating an archive has been since 2002 his self-built home. Nico lives in his self-built home, which is inspired by Japanese architects. It's inspired by Yona Friedman. But what's incredibly important, I think, that he lives in that self-built home, which is his archive. In the meanwhile, since 1998, he has created 120 productions, which are prints, which are books, which are catalogs, which are vinyl records, all dealing with the archive, activating the archive. And it all comes together in that self-built home. And this reminds me of a question I asked Nico not so long ago. I said, when you studied chemistry, transformative chemistry, and you were interested in alchemy, what were you reading then? And he said to me, I was reading Gaston Bachelard. And when we think about the ontology of relations of Gaston Bachelard, we find something which is so important for the whole idea of the archive, which is the archive as a form of dwelling, as a form of a creative imagination, and indeed as a poetic space of education. And Bachelard is talking himself about the house as almost this embodiment of creative imagination, of a poetic space of education, and of indeed dwelling. This idea by Bachelard is taken upon also recently by a philosopher who is also dealing with archives in a critical way, and that's Emanuele Coccia, when Emanuele Coccia says, please forget this whole thing about archives now. We are completely governed by archives, not in the least because of the digital. What we have to do is to try to create an interior life and form of interiority in these millions of archives. So he doesn't think that a museum is something for a collection of objects or archives, but it has to create life. And Nico is exactly doing that by living in this self-built home. And I feel that when I hear Essam, and I'm really happy that almost all of you are now living in Brussels, which makes me truly jealous, being a Parisian. And I feel this idea of the poetic dwelling also when I hear Essam talking. Nico, up to you. This whole idea of the self-built home, what has that to do with you and your way of trying to activate your archive?
Well, maybe I have to start at the very beginning, because the archive, the physical archive that I have in my house started in the late 90s when I studied in the United States. I went for 2 years to Boston to study film. And when I returned home in the late 90s, from a very pragmatical reason, I thought, yeah, how am I gonna ship all the records, books, works that I did there to Belgium? And I wanted to, from a very pragmatical reason, make it portable. So I kind of had a few suitcases and tried to put everything in that suitcase. So I started to Xerox certain elements from books. I started to record sounds so I could them on a smaller format. I took a few films that I made and I made it portable. And this kind of made me, of course, very much interested in the portable laboratory of Francesco Varela, which I then started to study. And I started to study neuroscience, which maybe connects it again to my chemistry background from before. But the archive that in the beginning started to grow was a very personal one. It was a one that kind of very much related to my own work. But then slowly, when being back in Belgium and seeing all these different elements that I took in the space in between these documents, in between these films, in between these books, something started to grow, a space in which I thought this is a space I want to work in. And this is the space I further explored for the next I mean, 25 years till now. And then, of course, the archive became much more, let's say, a ground in which many other archives started to leak in. So I started to work with other people's archives. I started to implement other people's archives. And it became like a kind of collaborative process involving many different people. And parallel to this, I always had the idea I want to build a own house in which I could kind of not conserve, but make a kind of hub or a place where this archive can be stored and where it can become, let's say, a working ground where people can meet, where people can go into the archive and people can look at the books, have discussions. And of course, it was a very slow process. It took me maybe more than 10 years to finish this house because I wanted to do everything also myself. And I wanted to take it slow. So I can also really think about every single thing you build to maybe change it or to slightly change it. So for me, it was almost like building the house on a scale 1:1, like a model you would make, but then a model on scale 1:1, and take that slow process. And maybe it's still not finished today, even though it has a kind of finished presence, but maybe it's still something that goes on.
Yeah. And why Gaston Bachelard? Because you came up with the name of Gaston Bachelard. He was extremely important for you in the middle of the 90s before you started Archive.
Bachelard for me, and maybe it also was mentioned in one of the previous presentations, like Maurice Blanchot, there are these kind of figures, and Edouard Glissant is another one, in which many different disciplines come together, where poetry mixes with philosophy, mixes with science. And I think in a person like Bachelard, for me, when I was studying chemistry, he was a very good example of the chemistry or the science or the transformation science that he was writing about, which was absent in the university. And so I was attracted to such a person because I saw there a space for imagination, a space for transformation, a space with possibilities.
Because Bachelard is also talking about the poetics of the house as an ideal place for self-education, no?
Yeah.
So do you think that an archive needs a house, needs a place? Because we have been hearing also about the digital. Does it need a place?
It needs a place, but if it needs a physical place is another thing. I think it needs because I have for all those years been also thinking about the accumulation of the archive, which can be a trap or a problem in which you have at a certain moment so much footage or so much information that it becomes a burden. And how can you make it still flexible, portable, movable, living? And I'm still thinking, and that's why I also did in the last 20 years, a lot of, let's say, translation acts where I take a part of my archive, somehow destroy it in order to create something new with it. And then I continue with the new perspective and I throw away all the other stuff in order to be able to kind of constantly renew it or rethink it. And maybe in the end, it becomes just a small pin you can put on your jacket. And as soon as you touch upon it, it starts to unfold as a kind of memory lane, as a kind of mushroom network. And then it becomes very portable.
You said that you have
utopian idea, because I still collect a lot of books. I still buy a lot of books. I still study a lot. So you still start to accumulate. But yeah.
Talking about accumulation, you said that this house was built particles very slowly about every component you have been thinking, every add-on you thought about. Do you do the same with your archive? That in order to enter your archive, you create a lot of obstacles, you create a lot of constraints, a lot of conditions, or do you amass things? Do you put things all together and then you select? Or every selection is really a form of taking measurements? Not materially, but in terms of content, of course.
Yeah, I think it's very well thought of. Like, and it's not that I accumulate so much, but in the accumulation that happens, there is also a constant how to say, a constant exercise of shrinking and expanding. So as soon as I feel that things are starting to expand, I explore the expansion, but then I want to go back to a shrinking. So it's a little bit like a breathing exercise. So like it breathes out and then it breathes in. In order, again, to keep it in a very alive situation. Otherwise, you cannot handle it. But through this exercise, it becomes difficult for other people to step in and to understand what is going on in the archive, because there is, of course, lapses, holes, missing parts. And of course, I can still fill them in because partly it's still in my memory. Even though also there, sometimes there is holes or lapses because I cannot memorize, or I forgot, or I changed it over the course of time. I think it's that, but it's not there anymore.
So you're not afraid about delete, because
No,
a lot of
no,
people working with archives, they don't want to hear the word delete.
No.
They get the complete hysteric attack.
No, this is
delete.
For me the main button in developing an archive, the delete button.
Another question is, and I think that will be interesting for our colleagues who we heard before, how do you exhibit? Exhibit can be performative, can be in the digital, can be in form of a film, can be in the form like Goda is doing to create this website. How do you exhibit? How do you exhibit an archive? Because you talk about the word exposé, not just in the form of exhibition, but it's a performative act.
It's a very difficult question to answer, but because I had in the past many times people asking me to show the archive, but I was never really interested to put the archive on display because I don't see the necessity of filling vitrines and having these documents or these elements there, because you cannot touch them. I think that the archive has a tactility, but the tactility needs to be really taken serious. And as soon as you can take a document and really digest it, something can start to grow from it. So I think I'm more interested in not putting the archive on display, but performing or putting it in a condition that it can perform. Until so far, I mean, in the last 20 years, there was not so much interest from institutions to maybe step into that process of going with me through the archive, selecting a few things and creating new perspectives or creating performative aspects of it. But parallel to it, of course, by myself, I started to, let's say, distill certain projects from the archive, because I consider the archive really as a working tool from which projects grow and develop, and to which these projects also return afterwards, so they can sit together with all the other information and create new relations. But parallel to it, I have always been, as you said, creating printed matter. Which
digital is not your thing, right?
It's partly, but I believe more in the analog distribution of a book or some printed matter, which for me, at least in the experience, has a longer life. It's something that, disperses in a different way than the digital. It's maybe less formatted. And so I have been publishing around 120 printed matter, which are all translations of that archive that is here in the house. So it's potential translation acts that have a kind of performative quality and that spread. I mean, that go to other people and people can use it as tools or as working tools to communicate, and out of this communication, other things start to grow.
Last question to you, because Stephanie gave us 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Can everybody visit the house? Can everybody come to you?
Well, if you send me an email, if you contact me, of course, you can come. Yeah.
So but Stephanie, that was it.
It's not how to say, it's a domestic place. So it's kind of, you come into a very domestic, intimate space. So it's not like you would go to a museum and you go into a library or in an archive of an institution, you go into a domestic space. So, and with this domestic space come a lot of, people could call it obstacles, but it's not obstacles. It's kind of like it comes with a few conditions, which are not always easy to maybe overcome or to, I don't know.
Which brings us back to where we started off with Gaston Bachelard. Your archive is a form of dwelling, a space for creative imagination. It's an intimate space. It's an intimate space for education. And I think that's the great thing about your archive, that the place is part of making the archive not alive, but making a living archive.